Okay, if the internet allows it, I am live again for some more Odinmade Hero. There we go. YouTube says I'm upcoming. How can I be upcoming if I'm already here? Okay, there it goes. So, it is Friday again, so that means it's time for another stream. It's been weird streaming so much of this series and then backing it off to 3 days a week. 3 days a week still felt pretty busy, but going to 1 day a week has really given me time to just internalize what is happening during each day. And because I can take my time, I don't have a time crunch to finish each day within the window of a stream. I can take my time and kind of go through things and make sure that whatever it is Casey is covering in that day, it's really sticking and I understand all the code changes that are happening. And then, of course, coming on stream here, this is only the second week doing it this way, but coming on stream here, I get to go through it again and really cement things and kind of share what I've learned, what I picked up on. So before we cover days 84 and days 84 and 85, because I did 2 days this week instead of just one, because they're pretty closely linked, and even next week it'll be similar. It's just a lot of dealing with the ground for a whole week's worth of Handmade Hero, so I thought it made a lot of sense to bundle those together. But before I get into that, something that I just saw, which is just kind of funny to me, I can't really share it, but it says, oh, I see, it's a party hat emoji. I don't know if everybody can use this emoji. Has this emoji always been here? I guess it's always been here. But I can wish myself a happy partner anniversary. I guess today is the anniversary of me. I don't think I have chat up. Maybe I should put chat up. I guess today is is it 10 years since no, that can't be right. 11 years, 12 years. It's been an enormous amount of time since this channel made partner. If I were to try to become a Twitch partner today, it would never happen. But because I'm old, I have been grandfathered in, and they have not decided to take it away from me. So that's neat. Still a partner after all this time. So there you go. So day 84, I think day 84 might have been scrolling ground textures. Is that right? Yeah. So what happened at the end of day 83, which is where Casey talked about pre-multiplied alpha, we got this sort of composited ground texture properly compositing, I guess you could say. It blends all together to be a nice sort of seamless texture. You can see there's some spaces where it's not actually covering the whole sort of dimensions of the texture. Maybe it's easier to see if I go up here. But you can see there's some spaces missing, but doing the pre-multiplied alpha just made it blend more correctly, so you don't have these weird dark shades everywhere. And so that's what Casey covered last time. But then on day 84, he started kind of brainstorming, and I think I can go, actually, let's just go, we'll jump to, is it this commit? Yeah. So I go here, I can bring up my notes. Again, I'm not going to go into them in detail because they're probably not very good. It's really just stuff that I'm jotting down in the moment to try and make some of this stuff stick a little bit better rather than just, copying the code and listening to the lectures. I don't imagine that I'll refer to these notes much at all ever, especially outside of stream, but we'll just, kind of go through things as they come up. If I can remember to go back to notes, then I will. But really, it was just a lot of these notes are observing Casey brainstorming how to deal with the ground buffer stuff and how to make it essentially actually scroll. Because before, you'll probably have noticed that the texture is scrolling with the player as he moves. But after day 84, and Casey's just kind of thinking through everything, we get to a stage where we can splat it out, this time over a much bigger area here. It's like spreading out past the space of the room that we're stuck inside of. And the idea for that, I think, was to make, or the reasoning behind that was to try and make updates less frequent. There's some things that Casey adds in that he then kind of pulls out in the next day, as we'll see. But now, at the end of day 84, there's a ground texture that actually scrolls underneath, and we're like moving over it like it's real terrain, which is kind of neat. Like now, if we're over here, it kind of looks like we're actually in a 2D game. Obviously, there's still no real gameplay to speak of, but we can walk around, and then we can walk off of it because we're only drawing the one texture in. But the idea is that over time, we'll get it filling in all the way to fill out all these rooms. So no matter where we're walking to, we'll see more and more ground texture. So there is that. And if we fast forward now to day 85... things get a little bit more interesting. I don't know what I'm trying to do. I think I just want to go to the top of this branch. So if I go to my day 85 notes, let's see here. Just checking on the stream, make sure I'm not collapsing in frames. And so things get a little bit more interesting in day 85. Casey kind of walks back some of the stuff he was talking about in day 84, which is that we have all of this notion of like drawing that basically, if I go back to day 84 notes, this is kind of the highlight moving into day 85. As the player moves, we draw the beginning of the texture into the new space where they're moving in, and then it's always kind of seamless. You're always basically taking the texture at the beginning and moving it to the front as you get to the end. And so doing that over and over again, so that even if the texture is the same, it feels like you're actually traversing a world. And then you put different obstacles in random places. You put ledges and enemies and different walls in different places, staircases or whatever, to make it feel like you're actually moving through a world. And that's all well and good. But in day 85, Casey kind of walked that back and then came up with this solution to have a 256 by 256 chunk. And I guess one thing before we go to that, this is one thing that doing multiple days makes difficult, is I meant to actually show some of the code that had to do with that change. So to get the ground texture to actually scroll with us, we added a position to it here in the game state, right? And then we set that to just be the camera's position, right? And then in this, I think this used to be draw test ground or something. It gets renamed to draw ground chunk, draw ground chunk. So now it takes this world position, which is used to create a seed. And this kind of got me thinking that maybe I'd need to do something different at some point. I've mentioned this before with the random generator on Odin's context, but I don't know that, I still don't know that that's actually going to need to happen, because it worked pretty fine right here. It's just, you'll remember, maybe you'll remember that at one point we were resetting, if I can type correctly, we were resetting the seed for the random generator outside. Well, at first we were setting it inside of the initial game. Gosh, what am I trying to say? We were setting the seed inside of the game initialization, which only happens once in startup, right? And then because that was only happening the one time, it was going to be different every single time. And so then we were seeing the ground texture being splatted all over the place. Every single frame, it would be set to something else because the seed would be different. But now things have changed enough to where we can put this back in here. See, before I had to take that seed set and move it outside of where we're initializing the game. But now I can move it back in because we're just doing that here, and it's always according to the chunk position. So it's random so that the texture looks different, but it's static in that it's fixed to that position. And then when we do these random number generations, right, that gives us the actual splatting to come out randomly in a way that looks unique. So no terrain that's being drawn into the ground texture looks exactly the same. It looks random enough that it looks hand done almost. So now if I go back to day 85, like I said, we go back into the notes here, Casey decides to actually have an array of these composited ground textures, and moves that ground buffer bitmap member on the game state into its own type, which is kind of different, and it's a little bit difficult. Like, I was watching him doing it and trying to make sense of it as he was doing it, and it really didn't make sense until the end. So I'll just kind of walk through it and see if that makes it clear for myself and proves to me that I actually know what's going on here. But let's see here. Yeah, so rather than have like one big ground texture, he decides we're going to create a bunch of ground chunks, which you can also think of as tiles. He refers to them as both tiles and chunks, I'm pretty sure. And that way they're just drawn, they're pulled out of the array to be put seamlessly into each position of the world as you're walking along it, so you get that same effect. And so we're just trying to solve that problem of making it feel seamless and different. So you don't want it to be, you don't feel like you're actually exploring a world if everything looks the same, right? If all the textures you're walking across through each room don't look any different, it kind of stifles that sense of progress that you want to be feeling as you're moving through things. So this is just trying to think through all of that and how we can make the world feel unique as we traverse it. And some of this is just like, I don't think he implements this part right here in day 85. If a ground buffer is encountered that doesn't need to be drawn, we can shuffle it to the end of the slice. I'm trying to remember, and I don't think that happens. But it gets a little more interesting when talking about the transient arena. He gets to this point where he decides, okay, we're going to create this array of these ground chunk textures to pull from, to draw whenever and wherever according to the implementation that we write. When he goes to do that, he creates a transient arena, or he tries to, and then he finds out that he was already using the transient memory storage to create the sim regions, which is happening over here, right? Before, I was creating a sim arena, and I think I was storing that on the game state. But when he sees that, he actually goes on this sort of tangent where he talks about how to split up the transient memory, and it gets a bit confusing for me. I still don't understand totally why he does things the way he does them, and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail in a little bit. But these are the three ways of dealing with memory allocation with these arenas that he kind of talks about, and he says that he's still not married to any of these solutions, but as far as I know, he sticks to the fixed approach. Maybe he does pseudo-fixed. I honestly can't remember, but the point to take away from this, especially for me in using Odin, is that both of these basically apply to Odin's either static or buffer arenas, where a static arena will just give you the memory, allocate the memory for you, whatever you ask of it. Whereas the buffer will create an arena out of memory you've already allocated. So they're pretty similar, is my understanding. But the difference between these two approaches is that with a fixed memory layout, you're like being very strict about what each system in the game can use as far as memory goes. Like the physics gets, X amount of memory, the entities get this amount of memory, and they're never allowed to, like rendering is never allowed to take more memory from another one of these systems to do some heavy lifting in the event that something like that happens. It's like giving yourself some more flexibility in the, kind of pseudo-fixed, which is aptly named here. Whereas if it's fixed, there's no flexibility. So those are really just kind of inverted from each other. I'm not sure how I would even do this using Odin's built-in arenas, the pseudo-fixed. I mean, it's tough for me to think about how, because I mean, you can technically give two arenas the same allocated memory in the case of the buffer arena. When I tried doing that to do this ground chunk stuff, everything was blowing up on me, and I wasn't getting any helpful error messages. It just led me to believe that I probably just want to split up the memory according to however much I think each system of the game is going to need that memory, and just go, okay, that's it. This arena gets that memory, this arena gets that memory, and so on and so forth. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated because, before I get into that, we'll talk a little bit more about this third strategy, which is simply what Casey calls free-for-all. That is, when we run out of memory, we just keep on getting more memory from the system, and then we chain it all together as a linked list. And that's exactly what Odin's growing arena appears to be to me. And you can see all of these if I go into the docs here. Growing arena. There's a different init call for each of these. I don't know if maybe if I just go up here, yeah, arena kind. So it's really just one between these two. It sure seems like you can't really do a pseudo-fixed arena without trying to do something clever and probably wrong in Odin. I mean, you could probably implement your own, right, and do your own bookkeeping. But if I'm just going to use Odin's arenas, I'm going to use one of these three, unless I have a very good reason not to. But that pretty closely approximates what Casey was talking about in day 85 here. So how am I doing on time? Not too bad. So, yeah, the downside of just having a growing arena, one that'll just keep on allocating and allocating and allocating whenever it runs out of memory, is that we might find ourselves with a nasty problem of just allocating way too much freaking memory and not being aware of it until it causes a very specific problem where, like, we wouldn't see a problem until long after we had started doing something bad with memory where we're just allocating way too much. And so that's not good. So sticking to the buffer arena, it's been working out pretty well. I did have that one bug a while back where trying to create it on every frame was causing quite a bit of slowdown, but moving that into the initialization block at startup really solved all of that. So I'm not too worried about it. And this is kind of where it gets messy. This is what I was talking about. I don't understand why Casey was doing this. So he talks about the transient arena and the different kind of arena strategies, right? Fixed, pseudo-fixed, or free-for-all. And then he talks about the motivation for talking about all this is because he wants to put these ground buffers that we allocate during startup. He's talking about allocating those with the transient arena. But he wants them to persist after every frame. So it's a little confusing to me, right? Because if they're going to allocate, let's see here. If we're going to have these ground buffers be allocated and then persisted in the transient memory every frame, then they aren't really transient. They're permanent. They should be a part of the game state always. So maybe there's just something that I'm missing that should be obvious, or maybe it's not so obvious and I'm not a dope for not seeing it. But either way, I just kind of wish I could ask him, like, why would we want the ground buffers to be part of the transient state? And Odin kind of makes this distinction, or would make this distinction pretty easy for us to make sense of, because we have the context allocator and then the context temp allocator. They seem like it seems like a nice one-to-one thing, where it's like anything that I want to permanently have around for the lifetime of my application, I allocate it with the context allocator. Anything that I can throw away after each frame or cycle or whatever, allocate it with the temp allocator. And so that's what I was doing before. I was creating the sim arena and then creating an allocator out of it, and then assigning that to the context temp allocator to create the sim region, right? And then I was freeing it. I had like a defer, what was it? Yeah, I was assigning it to the context temp allocator, and then I was doing a free all on the temp allocator every single time. But that doesn't work if I need the ground buffers to persist in that transient arena. You see? So it's just that I struggled with that for a bit. And I was trying to think through, okay, well, and then later on, Casey demonstrates how he's going to deal with it, which is that he has the transient arena, which some portion of its state, some portion of the memory that it's allocated into that arena is kept around every frame, but then everything after it gets wiped out. So that, what does he say? He says he wants to bungee back up to the end of the state where the ground buffers are stored. And he calls it like begin temporary memory and then end temporary memory. And basically he starts that after creating the arena during the first startup, and then into the game loop right when he wants to start that temporary memory, which is right before creating the simulation region. He makes that call to begin temporary memory. And then at the very end, he calls end temporary memory. And so there's some nuance there that I'm leaving out because I didn't implement it, because I wound up figuring out that there's something pretty similar that I can use with Odin to accomplish pretty much the same thing, which is I have my transient state, I have my ground buffers that I want to keep around, but I want to reset that arena back to a certain state at the end of each frame, because I don't want to keep that memory around. And so what I did to accomplish that is just these calls here. I hear my dog barking. Why is he barking? JNPL95, congrats. Wish YouTube comments were available on his videos because of stuff like this. There'd be an explanation for transient by someone in the comments. Yeah, absolutely. I think you're probably correct about that. I understand his motivation for not leaving comments on making comments unavailable on his YouTube videos, but sometimes there is useful information that people leave. I guess there's no way of verifying it if it's just from some random, because sometimes people will get small details wrong. It's a double-edged sword. I don't know why you turned off all YouTube comments. Yeah, it's for that reason, where I guess a lot of comments he probably focused on, and this is a classic like content creator, YouTuber phenomenon, is that you fixate on like either the comments that are negative or the comments that are just totally wrong. And then you get upset because people are saying things that are wrong and then could be changing other people's minds. People go and read the comments. So he turned off comments because he was looking at it both from the perspective of a viewer and also from the perspective of himself. He's like, I think he phrased it at one point by saying that he doesn't believe that people, when the barrier to entry is so low and you can just leave a comment, there's really no trust. Like, you could be anybody. You could just be some weekend warrior, right? Which is essentially what I'm at, at this point. I spend at most 10 hours on this a week, whether I'm on stream or off stream, right? I'm not a pro game dev by any means. I'm just trying to learn what I can on the side. and it's not even that generic. It's specific to games programming that I'm a noob at. Like game dev altogether is still totally out of my wheelhouse, right? So anyway, I can kind of understand it, but it is a double-edged sword because it would be nice to have people that do know what they're talking about watching his series and then being able to like expand on things further or ask questions in the comments that he then could have responded to himself instead of having it all be in the form of the Q&A sessions at the end of his streams. There's no right or wrong answer, right? It's just whatever format you choose to do, which is kind of maddening. You have to go with something that works for you, but that's different for everybody. So anyway, to kind of approximate what he did with that begin and end temporary memory thing, I kind of looked and I perused the Odin documentation here, and there were these arena temp begin, end, reset, and ignore calls that are all part of that same virtual package in Odin. And so I decided to try it out and see if that worked. And sure enough, it did. So what I do, right, is that up here, we have a new block where we initialize this new transient state type. So that's where the ground buffer got moved to. Before it was just a bitmap, but now it's got its own type. And it simply has the position where that ground buffer is currently being drawn to. And this changes, I believe, or it will change eventually. Right now, we're not doing anything. We do like a little test fill at startup, and then we do nothing else with it. I think it's in the next day when this position will be used a bit more. And then there's the memory where the actual like texture is drawn to. So we keep a slice of that around using more slices. There's this template thing, which just is a way of giving us the width, height, and pitch of the thing to draw. Because Casey notices like there's no point in keeping a bunch of bitmaps stored as ground buffers because they're all going to be the same dimension, right? They're 256 by 256. The pitch is going to be the same. The width and height are going to be the same. So that's why these attributes get stored in the template, and then that gets used to inform things at draw time, I believe. And then, of course, we have a flag the same way we do on the game state to see if it's initialized. And then there's the transient arena. I just call it arena on the member. He calls it something like tran arena or transient arena, right? That just seemed kind of redundant to me. So it's really not that different from the regular game state where we have the game state and then we have our world arena. It'll get trickier when we start splitting this up into, like, I think he talked about adding like a fundamental types arena. And I honestly don't even know what the point would be of doing that. But at some point, I'm going to have to revisit that. And it's going to change the fact that I'm overwriting the context allocator here on every game loop, right? I'm doing that and just using the world arena. But if we wind up having multiple arenas for permanent storage, we can't do that anymore. I'm going to have to pass each arena or allocator in to each subsystem as needed and then overwrite the context allocator there. But for now, I figured that could stay like it is because we are only using that one arena for that one thing. So instead of overwriting the context temp allocator and then freeing all of that, what I do is I begin that temporary arena, which I think is pretty similar to it's effectively doing the same thing that Casey's begin temporary memory is doing, right? But instead it gives us this temp arena type, which honestly, I don't know. It doesn't seem to do anything. Like, you don't pass it around. You can see here in this comment, an arena temp is a way to produce temporary watermarks to reset an arena to a previous state. All uses of an arena temp must be handled by ending them with arena temp end or ignoring them with arena temp ignore. So if I don't make this call down here to end the temporary arena, and that literally seems to be all it's used for. You get it out when you say you want a temporary arena, and then you end it down below. I'm using defer here to first check, and this is the other thing that Casey did. He had a check arena call that he implemented, which simply asks, let me think about this. Yeah, after the temporary arena has been ended, or the temporary memory has been ended, we're checking to make sure that the temp count, and this is literally what he calls it, right? I'm pretty sure on his thing that he implements, is that we're making sure that it's actually been reset. So this ends it, and this makes sure that it's been reset properly. Is that right? And we're calling it in this order because we want to check after we end the temporary arena, and that's the way these defers work, right? I have to think about this every single time I look at this, but we defer the check because we want that to happen at the very end. And the way that it works is that the defers kind of unwind first in, last out. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but if I call this here, it's going to happen after this, at the end of this, at the end of each game loop, right? And so by doing that, like the only difference here, right, is that Casey would put it at the end without these defers. How did that happen? Why did I copy a note there? That's weird. Right, if I didn't have these defers, then we would swap the order and do this. That's basically what Casey's code looks like. He ends the temporary memory. In this case, we're ending this temp arena type instance, and then we check it to make sure that it was reset properly. And if I run it, which I don't think I've run this code yet, you can see that we have our one little 256 by 256 ground chunk. It draws in the origin because that's where we told it to draw. Same way Casey's was, and now we can move on to bigger and better things, which is drawing them everywhere, and getting it to a point where as we move through the world, those chunks from that big slice of ground buffers will just fill in wherever we need them to as we're walking around. So it's still very much a work in progress to get to that point where we have those seamless ground textures, and after doing that, I'm pretty sure that creates a bunch of slowdown with the software renderer, and that's what leads Casey to do more rendering stuff and get to a point where he's doing SIMD, and that's when we'll kind of optimize things to run a bit faster. So it's going to be a lot of rendering stuff very soon, but it already has been a decent amount over these past few days of Handmade Hero, and I like it. I'm glad that I had the chance to dig more into Odin's packages. That was a fun little detour to get this working. Again, I still don't really understand why we need to do it this way. Like, my instinct would have been to keep the ground buffers in the permanent game storage, just allocate them with the world arena, because what's the difference, until we actually have a good reason to split up the arenas by whatever. Like, I guess you could make like a texture arena or something, I don't know, and have world arena allocate the world. I maybe at some point it'll be more clear to me, but that's what I would have done, and then you wouldn't need to do this, right? Maybe there is some kind of advantage to doing this resetting of an arena, but the way it would have worked before, and this is exactly how it worked before, is that, like I said earlier, we just created a sim arena or a temporary arena and then freed the whole thing, did a free all on the temp allocator at the end of each frame. But since we're not doing that, I'll just kind of walk through this a little bit. This looks pretty much the same as the way the game state is initialized, right? If we haven't already initialized the transient state, which is going to happen right after we initialize the main game state, we take the transient storage memory and allocate everything that isn't being used by the state itself. Not allocate it, but we take a slice of it, take a slice of all of that transient storage except for what's being used by the transient state, create another buffer arena with it. This is literally the same code that I was using with the sim arena or the sim region memory before. I create the allocator, which we have to do again below, because remember, this only runs once during startup. We create all of those ground buffers. We have our count of 128, and there's 256 by 256 of them. Or I'm sorry, there's there are 256 by 256 pixels. Is that right? Wide and high, and there's 128 of them. And then we go through each of them, and we create it's kind of interesting to me that this template is being made every single loop. Oh, I see. Yeah, so we do this. We make an empty bitmap to create like an empty ground buffer, right? And that's how we allocate the memory for each buffer, and then we overwrite it as we're walking through that slice after we've allocated it. And we just say that the position is null. And then this test fill, where we fill ground chunk, we just grab the first index out of that slice, and we say set it to the camera, and that's what gives us that center positioned sort of test fill ground chunk in the very beginning. So, and then so that persists, but it's once we get down here and we do this arena temp begin right before we start doing the simulation region stuff, that resets it back to the beginning. So we get to keep our ground buffers, and we get to free the rest of the memory in that arena to be used on subsequent frames and for additional stuff that we want to implement down the road. Now, the one thing that I did want to say that I'm still not clear on is that I printed out, and I'll just do this real quick because I wanted to be very sure that what I think I'm doing and trying to implement things as closely to Casey while doing it in Odin. I wanted to test really quick and be like, okay, if at this point we haven't used any more memory to begin the simulation of all the entities and stuff, right? Then our arena, which has a total used member on it to tell us how many bytes are being used by the arena, and that's on the transient state, right? Right before that, and then right at the end, in fact, I guess the way to do this is I would have to make this print call. Well, no, you would just do it after the simulation is started, right? So what am I doing here? I'm printing out the total memory used on this arena before we begin the simulation, before we begin the temporary memory. And then while we have that temporary memory being used by the simulation, right? Because we've begun it here, and then we defer the end to it. So the way this will happen is that after each iteration of the game loop, at the very end, after it's done the drawing and everything, it'll end the simulation here, and then it'll end the temporary memory, and then it'll check to make sure that we don't have like a misalignment with the memory, and it was actually reset to where it needed to be. So like basically, if we ended the temporary memory too soon, right? I think that's what that means. I don't know. It's kind of weird because we're not making a free call here, and so it just kind of trips me up. But anyway, the point is that if we're in the middle of using some of that temporary memory, the total used here should be different than it was before we started the simulation, right? But when I go and run it, the number comes out to be the same. And I don't really know what to make of that. It tells me that maybe I'm doing something wrong. You can see I would expect the numbers to be alternating, but this looks to me like we're still using all of the memory that's being used for the simulation is still allocated on that arena. So it tells me that maybe I'm doing something wrong, and that everything I've said here that I think is happening is wrong. And maybe there's a better way to check it. I'm not sure. But the fact that it is working, right, and it's not allocating, like you'd expect that if it's holding on to that memory after enough frames have elapsed, we would then crash because we'd run out of memory in that transient arena, right? It's just a different way of thinking about things. It made me question everything that I thought I knew about Odin's allocators, specifically the context allocator and temp allocator, because I thought that the way I was using those before was a totally reasonable way to go about doing things. I think the lesson here is probably to just go buy Carl's book on I can't remember the title of it. I think it's like Understanding the Odin Programming Language. And I'm pretty sure he talks about, all of this context allocator stuff and more in pretty great detail. And for me, for my benefit, obviously, because I'm still relatively new to Odin, I've been using it since like late summer, something like that. So it would probably be good for me. It seems like it's a pretty reasonable price. It's not a printed book. It's like an ebook, but I think it's probably worth its weight in digital gold. It's worth its weight in Bitcoin to be able to read that and just kind of get some more insight, because he does have his overview, and then of course there's the Odin overview. If I go back over to the docs here, so if I go in here and then I go to let's look up context allocator. Let's see. Yeah. Context.allocator is for general allocations for the subsystem it is used within. Context.temp allocator is for temporary and short-lived allocations, which are to be freed once per cycle, frame, etc. And that obviously says right there that if we're using the transient arena to create an allocator, but we want some data in that arena to persist, then this is not the right call to assign that to the temp allocator. So maybe it simply means that overriding the context allocator is going to be for more granular kinds of allocation. Again, like if we know something needs to be allocated with either the world arena or a different arena that lives in the permanent game state, right, after startup, then at a later point in time, we can modify each call that gets made with an individual arena to use that allocator. And then at that point, when you're inside of each system, right, if there's going to be like a render arena or something, then you would override the context allocator in there, pass the arena to it and either create the allocator from there or just pass the allocator after you've made the allocator, and then just override that. And that way you're not passing the allocator explicitly to every single new make and free. Not that we have a ton of those things in this code base, but there you go. I think that's pretty much it. I guess we could jump into here and just see the little bit of change that took place. So it went from draw ground chunk to fill ground chunk, right? Is there a draw call to the ground chunk stuff? Can't remember. I think it's down here. Yeah, so this is where we actually draw the ground buffers. Okay, so first we got to fill it. Let me step back there real quick. Because we're not actually drawing it at this stage. We're drawing it into the... we're drawing into the empty ground buffer, right? Because if we go back to here, this is just a test fill. At this point, we've created all of the empty ground buffers, but there's still nothing in them. And so here, with just this test fill, because it's the only one we have right now, by next week, I'm pretty sure the whole, frame will be filled again. And then we'll actually start to do like scrolling fills as we move through the world. But for just this test, we pass in the address of that first one, right, which is right here. We have to pass in the transient state as well, so we can get the template out, which has the width and height that we need, right, to actually be able to fill it. But we overwrite the memory from that copy of the template with the pointer to the memory of this ground buffer that we want to fill, and then we assign it its position to be the dereferenced pointer to the game state's camera P. And so that's how it's being filled in and then assigned a position directly in the middle of the camera at startup when we start up. And then when we actually go to draw it, right here, we walk that slice and we ask if it's valid, and this is the same old call, which checks to see basically if the position is a null position. Because remember, when we go into, gosh, where is it? When we go to fill the ground chunk, sorry, not when we go to fill, when we go to allocate all of these buffers, all the bitmap memory for them, we're assigning the position to be null, which essentially says we have the ground texture, we have the ground buffer, but it hasn't been filled, and therefore it has no location in the world, so we say it has a null position. When we go to later draw that, over here, we're asking, is that position null or is it not? If it's got a position that's valid, then we get the bitmap template off of the transient state again. Again, we copy, we take that copy and assign its memory to be at that ground buffer's memory that we actually filled. And then we scale it a little bit, it looks like, to have it be rendered, let's see, both in the position and the dimensions that we want. Like, if I just said, well, that's not going to work. Well, actually, yeah, if I just did this and I took this out, you probably just wouldn't see anything, if I had to guess. Oh no, it's just off in the wrong place. And it's also moving with us again. So that's what this conversion, or not this conversion, but what this, well, yeah, okay, yeah, well, that makes perfect sense. It's the delta, right? It's the delta from wherever we're at. We adjust it by that. You can see because we're passing in the camera P there, and I should probably split this up because this is messed up. Split it up like that. So you can see we pass in the camera P, and then the position of the ground buffer itself, we convert that to meters to pixels to get the proper distance from the player or the camera. I guess I should say they're in the same location right now because we're fixing the camera to wherever the player is. But we then do that to get the actual position where we want to draw the ground, and then we just draw it. So there's just some different steps happening here and like, what was the motivation for all this? I had to keep reminding myself of that, because when you get to the endpoint here and it's actually working and we have this static ground buffer that's actually, staying in the world where we want it to stay, and then we can walk off it and walk into, greener pastures or browner pastures, as the case may be, walk into a different biome over here, why not? We want that to stay over there, and we also don't want to draw it if we don't have to, because that would waste memory, right? At that point, we can then overwrite the ground buffer's position to be null or whatever. So I think that pretty much captures all of it. The goal is to not composite the bitmap every single time, and to have the capability to then fill in the ground chunks, the ground textures wherever we're walking to. But we're still not quite there yet, right? Like I've said multiple times, Casey's right in the middle of doing all this work at this point. I can't remember what the next day is titled, but I'm pretty sure both of the next episodes of Handmade Hero are going to have me kind of wrapping up all this stuff and getting to a point where we're actually filling in the ground textures, filling the ground buffers into the world as we're walking around. Let's see here, Handmade Hero, day 86. Yeah, aligning ground buffers to world chunks. So that's going to go back to like how we had the world chunks in the world that we're using to actually give us, a place to put entities in, and all of this. Like it's all coming together more and more, using all of these things that have been built up to this point. But man, oh man, it's you would think it would be something so simple, and it's not that it's super complicated. It's just to have Casey brainstorm it and then implement it and then walk through like the changes as he's thinking of them. It's just, I'm blown away on multiple levels. I'm blown away that this is even working, that I'm still able to do this in Odin. Odin just makes it a lot of fun because I'm really figuring out the mechanics of what's going on in a way that just copying, like if I was just writing it in straight up C or C++, he's using C++, right? But it's basically C. If I was just copying it straight up, I just wouldn't be getting an appreciation for the mechanics of what's going on nearly as well, I don't think. It would be harder to appreciate it, right? Because when you have to actually think through and translate, okay, what are we actually doing here? I'm passing in pointers. The fact that I'm having to use a slice, right, instead of, and this has happened many, many times, and it'll keep happening over the course of this series, where I'm making a slice of ground buffers, which has the pointer and the length, instead of just using a multi-pointer, which in Odin would look kind of like this, but it just looks like a regular old pointer in C, right? It's just star ground buffer. And he doesn't use make, he uses his custom push, what is it? It's like push array call, right? And then it's something along those lines. He provides the count, he provides the arena instead of the allocator. But it's all effectively the same thing taking place. And yeah, I'm just excited to keep rolling. I'm sorry I've been a little bit all over the place. It probably wasn't the best idea to try and cram 2 days, both day 84 and 85 in one stream, but it's gonna happen, and the same thing's gonna happen next week, because there's just plenty of times, and this is part of the reason why I was motivated to change the format of the stream, is that, you know, he's really rolling from day to day with like one change. It's one change that's happening, but he's taking multiple days because he only streams 1 hour per day, right? At least at the onset. Later on, I'm pretty sure he switches to like a 1 week, 1 day a week stream format, but he streams for like 4 hours. I don't even know if I'll ever get that far, to be honest with you. But you know, for the meantime, I'm just gonna have to keep navigating that and try to. I'm hoping that the more I do it this way, the more organized I'll feel and comfortable in doing things this way. But I think the core thing for me is just, I definitely have a much better, I'm able to walk through the code of the last couple of days changes and really appreciate what is going on here from like a design perspective, in terms of not just trying to keep the code as sane as possible, but like what are we actually doing to try and add this capability to the game while keeping in mind cost of performance, right? And not just code organization, because really I don't know how much more that you could do to make the code more organized. There's a lot of stuff going on, but I mean, none of it is totally lost on me. I can look at any piece of code that was written in here and go like, what is this doing? It may get a little bit murkier once you get down into the world stuff, because it's so heavily abstracted, right? It's like, what the hell even is canonical? But if you look at all the places where that code is being called, it's not too hard to backtrack and be like, you know, okay, what am I doing? Why am I checking to see if an allocator is nil here? Oh, well, it's because if it is nil, then we don't want to allocate a new chunk. If it isn't nil, then we want to go ahead and get a new chunk. Because every single time we make this call, we're not always wanting to create a new chunk on demand. In fact, I don't even know, I could look and see. Well, that's the definition. It's been a while since I've looked at any of this. So yeah, right here, and this is, yeah, change entity to location. So at this point, we would go ahead and create that new world chunk. That's the definition again. But over here, whoops, we wouldn't, right? Because we're just doing the simulation. We're not looking to add an entity into a certain position. We just want to grab all the chunks out that are valid and have been created with entities in them, and then add them into our sim region that we're going to operate on each frame. So anyway, sorry for that little aside. I just got curious. I was like, can I really walk through this code and understand what the hell's going on? Oh, good point. Converting to another language makes you really have to solidify the meaning behind the things that he does. Yeah, it totally does. And it worked that way for Zig too. But Zig was just, and I've brought this up so many times on stream, but Zig just really put me through my paces in terms of like, I would have to work so hard to do something in Zig that Casey could do trivially with like casting and stuff, especially when it came to going in between unsigned integers and signed integers. Like that was such a pain in Zig. And so that actually kind of sidetracked me. Even though I was doing it all in a different language, it would sidetrack me. And also in Zig, and this is not Zig's fault, this part is actually my fault. I wasn't trying to use Zig's allocators because I was afraid of them. I probably shouldn't have been. I should have just rolled with it and been like, okay, what's the right allocator to use in this situation? Can I make an arena just using built-in Zig stuff, right? I just wound up doing things more one-to-one with what Casey was doing, which is using multi-item pointers, right? And keeping the length of the array everywhere. Whereas in this code base, I'm doing a lot of, slices, which I'm pretty sure Zig has, but I didn't really use slices at all in Zig if it does. So some of this is just like my own personal growth happening alongside with me using Odin, but Odin also made it a lot more explicit to me to use slices rather than multi-pointers. It just, everywhere I looked, it was beating me over the head, especially if I were to look at what other people using Odin would say. Like, if you're using a multi-pointer, you got to have a very good justification for that, and that usually boils down to interacting with some C stuff. Yeah, exactly, for the stuff that works. Sometimes, you don't have a choice. With using the temporary, again, like using the temporary arena thing, I'm not sure if this is actually doing what Casey's is doing, but it's so one-to-one, like the nomenclature. Begin temporary arena, begin temporary memory, check temporary arena, check temp memory. Or it's not check temp memory. I'm pretty sure Casey calls it check arena, right? So this is doing check temp arena, and then temp and arena and temporary memory. Obviously the order of things is different, but it seems pretty close to me. I need to figure out how to verify it is really my homework for this week. I want to be able to verify that we do actually reset the arena back to the state it's at this point in the loop at the end of each game loop. What do you think about people who clown on languages like C#? I've been using it as my main thing for about a year, but sometimes I see people hating. Sorry, silly question. I don't think it's a silly question. I have languages that I don't care for, right? Like JavaScript is one of them. But that's just because I've had to work on a lot of stuff that uses JavaScript, and I don't care for it. And it's not even because of JavaScript specifically. Some of it is like the ecosystem. I don't know. It's a really loaded problem. And I just don't think it's very productive to hate on languages. I think a lot of the time it comes down to like culture and like the project itself. I think because like any language, you can produce a terrible project in any language, and you can produce an amazing project in any language. You know what I mean? Like I've done my absolute best to write like the main project that I work on outside of work on my startup is an Elixir project. And I've done my very, very best to make that idiomatic. There are some parts of the code base which are so old and nasty that I try to stay away from them. But when I am forced to deal with them, I try and bring them into like more idiomatic Elixir using like the best practices of, whatever, today's Elixir style guide is supposed to be. And but my JavaScript project, which is a React Native project, is absolutely horrible. I could have done a better job. What the difference might be is that some languages make it easier to make a crappy project versus a good project, right? Like, and that might be the subtle thing where it's like, yeah, you can write a good project or a bad project in any language, but some languages make it easier than others. I just think it's all personal preference at the end of the day. You know, it's like guitarists arguing over whether a Strat is better than a Les Paul, or, you know, whatever your thing is that you like. If you like what you like and you feel good about using it and you're comfortable and confident and you can build good software with it, that probably matters more than what anybody else has to say about it. You know what I mean? JNPL said, yeah, I like the new format of the stream. I do miss the complete confusion and frustration you went through at times from all the bugs. I mean, I still kind of went through it today, right? Because I was like stepping through things and I was like, wait, is what I'm saying actually lining up with what's going on, what we're looking at in the code? I'm still going to get frustrated at times. Don't worry. That I know that's entertaining, but I definitely don't miss. It's just not a good feeling when I've spent 30 minutes looking at the same problem and I'm not making any headway towards finishing the stream. It's not that I don't see and appreciate the value in that. It's just that like I have a schedule to keep to, and I can't spend, like, there were some streams that got to like 3-4 hours long, and I was like, I just can't be doing this on a regular basis. I personally love C#, at least for Windows. It's very useful. I make small programs all the time to do useful things with its vast standard library. Yeah, C# just has so much that you can do with it. You can make desktop apps, you can make web apps, and like everything is at your fingertips, right? Particularly if you're on Windows. One thing that I do really like about Odin is that I feel like I can do just about anything on any platform. I guess I've read that Mac OS is like a second-class citizen as far as Odin is concerned, but I did the past 2 days of Odinmade Hero on my MacBook. I'm on my Windows machine now, but like I can go back and forth on this project, and it's seamless. I haven't had any problems with it. I've used other languages, but I felt more comfortable with C#. Might change my mind later on, but I didn't see many reasons for hating on it. Yeah, C#. Plenty of people. Look, the other good thing about C# is that like it's not going anywhere, right? Like it's Microsoft's language of building and eating the world. So if you keep writing C# and you get really good with it, you'll probably always have some work to do. Can't say that for more fringe languages. I can't even say that for Odin, right? Because I'm doing this more of a hobbyist thing. But and who knows what things will look like 10 years from now. I know over the last year, Odin has picked up a lot of steam, but you know, I'm not anticipating getting a job writing Odin anytime soon, if ever. I've been working on this big project I've been talking about in Elixir for, you know, over 5 years now, and I still, if I was to like actively search for a job in Elixir, I don't know that I could find one. I don't know that I could find a job that I would like using Elixir. Maybe. I wouldn't rule it out, but you know, I use Python for my day job, and the odds of me finding more work in Python are just probably astronomically higher. So yeah, thanks for chit-chatting with me and watching me kind of confusingly babble on about the past few days of Odinmade Hero. Let me see if there's anything else in here. Somebody asked a question about basically transitioning between different kinds of textures for the environment. So like if you were going to move from like, you know, an outside earthy terrain into like a more metallic structure or whatever, like you're moving into a concrete building or whatever inside of the game. And Casey basically just rebuffed with, you know, that's not really an issue. There's no issue with doing that with what he's built, because it's kind of an unrelated thing. He says this responsibility belongs to the compositor, and we don't have a compositor yet, I don't think. So either I'm missing something or we just haven't built that yet. It's a problem for later on. And then somebody asked about, you know, push versus pop and that nomenclature. He talked a little bit more about, you know, the difference between using new and malloc everywhere versus just throwing things into an arena. And he's talked about this multiple times, where rather than thinking about allocations in terms of like separate discrete instances, you think about it in terms of like one big system needs to allocate all the memory it's going to need to do all of its stuff. The problem with that, I guess, is in the world that I come from, almost everything is discrete. Everything is happening behind some API call that gets made from a client, right? And then I take that one discrete, request, and I make some changes to a database, and I bounce back a response. It's always happening, and for that reason, right? I don't do any manual memory management for my day job or anything that I do for my startup. It's all dynamic. It's all garbage collected, whatever. No problem, NT Code. One day I'll catch up to you in Handmade Hero. Yeah, I mean, it shouldn't be too hard if you're going at it aggressively. Now that I've slowed down and I'm only doing 1 to 2 days a week, if you're doing just 3 days a week, eventually you'll surpass me. Do be sure to check in and let me know how it's going. I'd love to see anybody else's experience, like just reporting back kind of the things that are standing out to you, because like just because of my experience and where I come from, different things are going to stand out to me, and I'm going to fixate on certain things more than others, whereas you might really fixate on other stuff. Like one big thing for me is like audio. I'm really interested in working more with audio, but he actually hasn't done much with audio at all since that first initial platform layer. And so that's kind of why I'm taking a step back from being as aggressive as doing as many days of Handmade Hero in a week as I was, is because I want to think more about audio. But that, for me, that doesn't even start with programming. It's understanding more of like the actual application of like creating music. And then somewhere down the line, I'll come back around to like, okay, because I don't know if Casey actually ever even gets to this, is like, how do I incorporate sound into a game? Like there's too much to learn. And I wish that I could learn it all, but I have to be particular and just learn the things that I can make time for that interest me the most. So that's all I've got. Thanks again for hanging out with me. We'll be back next Friday where I'll knock out 2 more days. Both days 86 and 87, aligning ground buffers to world chunks. And then I think, what was day 87? Seamless ground textures. So then we'll get into a point where we actually have a game world that's nice and seamless to traverse the terrain of. Oh man, I'm seeing other thumbnails here, and he's got like 3D stuff going on. Day 645, switching to voxel centers for collision. Well, that's a long ways away. Oh, man. Yeah, one day at a time. Have a good weekend, and I'll see you.